Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Isabella Towarovsky, and I'm a Senior Program Associate at the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. Thank you all for joining us today for our conversation, Babi Yar, marking the 80th anniversary of the tragedy, which we're glad to host in collaboration with the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program. I'd like to introduce Ambassador Mark Green, President and CEO of the Wilson Center, for opening remarks.
Great. Thanks, Isabella. 80 years ago, nearly 34,000 Jews were murdered over a 48-hour period at a ravine outside Kiev known as Babi Yar in Russian or Babi Yar in Ukrainian. Babi Yar is a crucial event in the history of the Holocaust, one of the earliest stepping stones on the way to a genocide of 6 million Jews, truly one of the darkest moments in human history. Babi Yar also stands as a symbol of erasure and forgetting what happens when history is made to serve political agendas. Gaps in historical knowledge have persisted, and efforts to establish a memorial worthy of the tragedy have inexplicably failed over and over again. Lord willing, that may be finally changing. It is a privilege for the Wilson Center to be able to host a conversation about this important topic. And to start our discussion, I am honored to have this chance to introduce Natan Sharansky. Mr. Sharansky is a human rights activist who fought for the freedom of Soviet Jews to emigrate to Israel so they could live as Jews. He's the chair of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. He also chairs the supervisory board of the Babi Yar Holocaust Memorial Center. Mr. Sharansky was born in Donetsk, Ukraine. After requesting from Soviet authorities permission to emigrate to Israel, he was arrested on trumped-up charges of treason and espionage. He was convicted in a Soviet court and served 9 years in the Gulag, with many stretches in a punishment cell. Following massive public campaigns by the State of Israel, world Jewry, and leaders of the free world, Mr. Sharansky was finally released in 1986, emigrating to Israel on that very day of his release. Mr. Sharansky led a political party in Israel and served as minister and deputy prime minister in 4 successive Israeli governments. He is the recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor in 1986 and the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2006. He is the only living non-American citizen who is the recipient of these 2 highest American awards. In 2018, he received the highest Israeli award for promoting Aliyah and the ingathering of the exiles. Mr. Sharansky is also the author of 4 books, Fear No Evil, The Case for Democracy, Defending Identity, and Never Alone, Prison, Politics, and My People. Again, it is a great honor for us to be hosting this event. Isabella, I turn it back to you.
Thank you, and Natan, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Isabella. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for inviting me to speak. As Ambassador Margreen mentioned, Babi Yar is probably the biggest mass grave of Holocaust, and definitely the grave which was filled with corpses quicker than any other place. 34,000 people were killed less than 48 hours. Everybody brought there, stripped, beaten, and killed. And it's like the symbol of these 1.5 million Jews of Ukraine who were killed by bullets. Together, at the same time, even before the Holocaust of concentration camps, before Wannsee decisions in Wannsee about liquidating all the Jews, there was started already Holocaust by bullets in Ukraine and Belarus and some other territories where Jews from villages or from the towns or from cities were gathered, brought to the adjacent suburbs and killed. So it is much less documented than Holocaust by Auschwitz and other concentration camps. And it is much, and that's why it is very important to restore the facts and the documents, the memory about it. And here comes the second problem, that Babi Yar is not only the symbol of the Holocaust by bullets, it is the symbol of the efforts of Soviet communist regime to erase the Holocaust in the memory. I was born in Donetsk, then it was called Stalino, a rather big city in Ukraine. And I was born in 1948, few years after Holocaust. My childhood was among killing fields of Holocaust in Kyiv, in Odessa, in Dnipropetrovsk, in Kharkov, and of course in Donetsk. In each of these places, tens of thousands of Jews were killed only a few years before I was born, and we grew knowing nothing about it. It happened though that 2 miles from my home was the deep coal mine. There was the shaft there was 400 something meters. It was not working, and 75,000 people were killed and thrown into this shaft. It is the second biggest mass grave of Holocaust in Ukraine after the Babi Yar. And we were playing just 2 miles from that place. And we were playing in war, playing the soldiers of the Red Army, defeating the soldiers of the Nazis. And we didn't know anything about existing this place. And the word Babi Yar was like whispered among Jews that some awful place and that something that authorities tried to hide. And then when I was 13, my father read with trembling hands, I remember it today, my father read the poem of young rising star, the poet Evgeny Evtushenko about Babi Yar and how it could be that there is no monument Babi Yar, and reminding the history of the pogroms and of anti-Semitism. And my father said with excitement, now we can finally speak about it. It continued like for 24 or 48 hours, because immediately started big campaign in official Soviet press. This poem was prohibited. The author was demanded to change the words, and so on. The outstanding Soviet composer Shostakovich wrote special symphony. He said, we cannot have the monuments, we can write music. This symphony was played once in Moscow and then was prohibited. And when finally in 1974, there was built a monument simply because of the pressure of so many people all over the word Jew was not mentioned there because Holocaust was not existing in the Soviet history. And when I became human rights activist and a Jewish activist, and of course, for my activity, I was detained many times before I was arrested for many years. But one of these first detentions was when I, together with my friends, tried on the anniversary of this massacre on the 30th of September to go to Babi Yar. So that was the policy of Soviet Union. And that is why, and what is also interesting to mention, the Nazis in the end tried to destroy the remnants of the Holocaust. For example, that mine that I mentioned not far from my home, they put a lot of caustic soda in order to turn all these corpses into some kind of biomass. The Soviets also tried to destroy physically the memory about that place. They turned Babi Yar into the biggest place for the waters from the different factories, like the biggest dustbin of Kiev. And then they just tried to turn it into the big stadium and then to kind of park, but to destroy the remnants of this awful place. So that's why it was so important and meaningful for me when 6 years ago, the mayor of Kiev came to me in Jerusalem and said, now we really want to start having, to launch a big memorial center. And we formed a very respectable international board. I'm honored to be the chairman there. And our ambition is no less and no more, but to have like the biggest and the only in its kind memorial museum of Holocaust by bullets, about those millions of Jews who were killed, like in Babi Yar. And symbolic thing, of course, that this museum will be in Babi Yar itself, in this huge area of Babi Yar. Now we are building this museum. And the last thing which I want to say, there is very often the question, why? Why the Soviets? After all, Soviet Union was fighting Germany, they defeated Germany, they're so proud, and Stalin got so much credit in those years. Why did he launch this policy of erasing the memory about the Holocaust? Because it was connected with the policy of anti-Semitism. Immediately after the war, Stalin started one of the biggest campaigns, maybe the biggest campaign against Jews, killing all the Jewish poets, Jewish writers, closing Jewish institutions, and preparing famous trial against doctors, which was like the signal for the campaign against all the Jews of the Soviet Union. And as a part of this anti-Semitic campaign, they needed to erase the history of Holocaust. They failed. We were really lucky, the Soviet Jews were lucky that Stalin died just at the highest moment of this campaign. And though anti-Semitism continued, but not on this level. But why it is important to remember? Because today we have in so many places rising anti-Semitism, old and new anti-Semitism. And almost always you can see that rising of the anti-Semitism means denial of Holocaust, reshaping the history. So it can be important side, important warning. If somebody is trying to deny Holocaust, to change the history, it means that they're preparing for the new anti-Semitic campaign. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natan, for these introductory remarks. We are going to go straight into the discussion, but what I'd like to do, I'm going to make a couple of announcements. So I'd like to remind you to stay up to date with our upcoming events and publications on our website, as well as our podcasts, Canon X and the Russia File. You can find our latest analysis of events in the region on our Russia File and Focus Ukraine blogs. Throughout the program, if you have questions for our guests, you can submit them via email to canon@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter @Canon Institute, or on our Facebook page. Please include your name and affiliation when sending questions. So we will start today's discussion with remarks from Martin Dean. Dr. Martin Dean works as a historical researcher for the Babi Yar Holocaust Memorial Center. As a research scholar at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, he was a volume editor for the Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos. His publications include Collaboration in the Holocaust and Robbing the Jews, which won a National Jewish Book Award. His current research is an analysis of the Babi Yar massacre, combining aerial photography, ground photographs, and witness testimony. Martin, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Isabella, for your kind introduction. Today, I will present new evidence on the history of Babi Yar. It serves as the most powerful symbol of the Shoah by bullets, the Nazi mass shootings of Jews on occupied Soviet territory. But still today, many details of what happened remain shrouded in mystery. To resolve some of these unknowns, since 2019, I've participated in a large research project, the Babi Yar Holocaust Memorial Center, which combines aerial photography, ground photographs, and the evaluation of witness testimony. Using these sources, I will reconstruct the route taken by the Jews into the ravine and identify the location of the mass shootings. By following the discarded property and clothing of the Jews, captured in contemporary photographs, this leads us like a trail of breadcrumbs to the site where the massacre took place. Soon after the arrival of German forces in the city on September 19th, 1941, a series of explosions caused by the Soviet mines started fires in the city. In response, the SS and Wehrmacht commanders decided to murder the city's Jews as a reprisal for the recent sabotage attacks. Placards calling on all Jews to present themselves at a specific road junction near Babi Yar were posted around Kiev by the Ukrainian police on September 28th. The threatened punishment for non-compliance was death. Jews, of course, speculated as to what this could mean. Jewish teenager Vera Bogutska, for example, noted, "Most people were of the opinion that we would be sent away to work." She describes further, "I saw that the streets were full of people carrying luggage. Some of them had carts. They were all going in one direction. Towards evening, my mother and I left our apartment with our luggage. We went down several streets with many other people. The collection point was near the Jewish burial grounds. In response to the placards, more than 20,000 Jews took to the streets of Kiev on September 29th, 1941. Here we see a 3D reconstruction of the first checkpoint created by the spatial tech team in Kiev, recently using available information about the local terrain. The checkpoint is described by witness Genia Batasheva and others. It was the place where non-Jews accompanying relatives and friends had to turn back. Vehicles could go no further, and the Jews had to continue on foot with only what they could carry in their arms. From here on, the Jews were more closely guarded. You see here, there's a checkpoint they had to pass through. This is a quote from a German witness, a driver for Sonderkommando 4A, Leonid Pushta. He recalled, "I drove out of Kiev and came to an alley. There was a checkpoint which let me through. I saw that along this alley, Jews were marching. They were going in groups as if for a stroll. On the left lay an enormous pile of luggage, which was about 3 meters by 2 meters. It looked like a huge pile of potatoes. The Jews threw their luggage onto this pile. At the end of the alley on the right, there was an open area where the registration took place." Now I want to give the testimony of one of the survivors, Reuven Stein. There is the question, why didn't Jews do more to resist? The main reason is that the vast majority of those in Kiev at the time were women, children, and the elderly. Almost all men of military age had been conscripted or evacuated. Reuven Stein recalls, "From the first steps of our journey, I began to look for a possibility to escape from the column. But how and in what manner? The column was escorted by armed Nazis, and when there was only about 250 meters remaining to Babi Yar, I jumped unnoticed out of the column into the ditch alongside the road and crawled into a drainage canal that ran under the street and sat there until it became dark. Later, I climbed out on the other side of the street and went through the old cemetery to the edge of the city. In the night, I then made my way home." So here we see an aerial view of the route they took. This is Melnikov Street coming out of Kiev, and the checkpoint near Pugachev Street is around here. They then come past the Jewish cemeteries here on the right. There are other cemeteries here and here, Christian cemeteries. The main column initially at least went to Kahatna Street and turned left, and then right down Dorogozhitska Street, which is also the alley of trees. Later on, these garages here were used to hold some of the Jews overnight, as there were literally so many people arrived they couldn't finish it all on the first day. And then the next morning, again, these were escorted down here. We know that the registration point was probably here up on the right, and then it's likely they marched through this main part of the Babi Yar ravine to the sand quarry here, and then finally the shooting ravine is here at the very end. Most historians agree on the route as far as this point, but where did they go once they entered the territory of Babi Yar? The main clues are a series of photographs taken shortly after the massacre by the German photographer Johannes Haller, who was working for the propaganda department. But these photographs, it seems he took them on his own initiative, so something that he did sort of spontaneously without being ordered to do so. And they're some of the most moving and graphic and important images of Babi Yar. For example, here we see vast piles of clothing in what looks like a sand quarry. And also here we see Soviet POWs covering over the ground in a long, narrow ravine. But where were these photographs taken? This was the difficult research goal that we set ourselves under the leadership of Karel Berkhoff at the BYHMC in 2019. To identify the shooting ravine with the POWs, we used the lone tree on the skyline as a reference point. This was visible in photographs of the main ravine taken after the war, but could not be seen at first glance on the Haller photograph. However, on close examination, you can just see it here on the tip of the in the same place, but it's obscured here by trees behind. So obviously you're not looking at this at the same angle as you are in these two photographs, where it's much more clearly visible. It's not that someone cut down the trees behind it in the meantime. So comparing these perspectives confirms that the Hala ravine is different from the main ravine, as it had quite a different angle on the lone tree. By using aerial photography, we were able to pinpoint where Hala was standing on the road, the end of the western spur, close to where the Sirets camp was later built. So here you see the road. By enlarging the aerial photograph, we were also able to identify the sand quarry, which lies between the two branches of Babi Yar, close to where they meet. So here you see the sand quarry. Its location was difficult to determine, as it is missing from most maps, including a 1924 topographical survey. The reason for this is that the sand quarry itself was only created by Soviet excavation in the late 1930s and had disappeared again with changes in the landscape after 1950, when a new road was built through the area. Thus, the shifting sands of Babi Yar have served to confuse historians for many years. In this photo, we see members of the SS searching the discarded clothing of the Jews for valuables. The clothing itself was also transported away in trucks and stored in warehouses for distribution to needy ethnic Germans or for sale to the local population. Private theft on a massive scale also accompanied the official looting. This original document sent by Sonderkommando 4A from Kiev lists hundreds of items of jewelry that were collected from Jews as they took their last steps into the ravine at Babi Yar. The list includes ladies' watches, more than 300 rings, and 95 decorative chains weighing more than 2.5 kilograms. This was likely just a fraction of the total collected there. So this is one of Hala's photographs, and note the photograph of a loved one left lying in the sand, captured by Hala's camera, probably just the day after the second day of the mass shooting. So he was there probably on October the 1st or possibly a little later. And you can see the details of everything that people discarded in the sand just before they were taken away to be shot. So most of the Jews were forced to undress in the sand quarry. This is confirmed both by witness statements and by the Hala photograph. This overhead view has been prepared using the 3D model created by Spatial Tech. It shows the positions of the discarded clothing seen in the Hala photograph. And it seems to indicate that the bulk of the Jews walked here around to the left, as is confirmed also by witness testimonies, and probably entered here as the shooting ravine. They probably went up this slope and then through this notch into this ravine where the shootings took place. So the Jews were driven into the left corner of the sand quarry to enter the western spur up a slope through a specially created passageway, the notch. A witness, Albin Pova, a German policeman, testified the Jews had to undress at the end of the quarry, went partly naked, partly in their underclothes over a steep slope, and disappeared into the adjacent valley or behind a mountain slope. From there, one could hear shooting. Just another aerial view. So for his iconic photo looking down the ravine, Hala would have been standing here at the end of the ravine, and the Soviet POWs were covering over the mass grave. Hala was standing, so looking down, I'll just show you this is roughly where Hala was standing. We also have descriptions of a very similar view by a German Sonderkommando 4A driver who parked his truck not far from here. And you can just see the sand quarry here on the right, the top of it, and the notch would probably be up here about halfway along the ravine. The Jewish survivor Dina Pronicheva, who claimed she was not Jewish, was told to wait by the sand quarry while the shooting was going on, and has described a lot of that. Here's a quotation. In the evening, a German officer arrived and said that we should all be shot, as if even one person got away, they would talk, and then the next day not a single Jew would appear. We were all led to be shot at the sandy notch, but we were not forced to undress because it was growing dark and the Germans were tired. Coming out of the so-called door from this notch to the left, there was a small ledge where all the people formed up and were executed from the opposite side with machine guns. People fell into a very, very deep abyss. I shut my eyes, squeezed my fists, and threw myself down before a shot came. I felt neither pain while I was falling nor the impact. My only wish was to live. Bronicheva subsequently crawled out from the pile of bodies and survived to testify several times after the war. In 1942, the security police in Kiev established a work education camp at Sirets near Babi Yar. It became a major torture center where hundreds of inmates died from the conditions or were killed. In its final phase, some of the prisoners mostly Jews, were used to exhume and burn the corpses at Babi Yar as the Germans tried to destroy the evidence. Prisoners at the camp also witnessed gas vans emptying bodies into Babi Yar, and also other groups. They could hear the shots from other groups of prisoners being shot throughout the occupation. At the very end of the work in the sand quarry to exhume the bodies, 15 prisoners managed to escape and later described the terrible work that they had been forced to conduct. Enlargement of the aerial photograph taken in September 1943, so exactly on the date just before the 15 men escaped, reveals two bunkers here in the sand. This is where the about 300 prisoners from Siretz camp were kept while they're doing the exhumation work. And here you see a guard tower opposite, which is also described very accurately by both guards and the survivor witnesses. And these barracks were sort of half buried in the sand. It's possible that these dark shapes are funeral pyres, but unfortunately the photograph is not clear enough for us to really determine that for sure, but they're about the right size. So finally, by describing in detail the terrain of Babi Yar as it existed in 1941 to 1943, especially the sand quarry, we can finally make sense of the many testimonies and determine the locations where key photographs were taken to document the trail of Jewish possessions left behind. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin. We are now going to Kirill Pfefferman. Once again, if you have questions for our guests, you can submit them via email to cannon@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter @Cannon Institute, or on our Facebook page. Please include your name and affiliation when sending questions. Kirill Pfefferman is a senior lecturer at Ariel University. He's also a member of the Yad Vashem Commission for the Designation of the Righteous. He's an expert on both the Holocaust and World War II in Eastern Europe and has written extensively on these subjects. Kirill, the floor is yours.
My apologies. Yes, so I will talk about the evacuation of Kiev and Jews as a prelude to, so to say, to what Martin has just described. It was, on the one hand, a long process that spent over several months. At the same time, it was a very short time period, as we will see right now. So let me begin with the general description of what evacuation of the Jews looked like in the Soviet Union during the war. It was a political issue during the war, and it became even more important political issue after the war, because during the Cold War, the accusations came mainly from the West. The Soviet government did not do enough to remove Jews who were in mortal danger and did not alert them that the Germans were approaching. And in this sense, they bore responsibility for what happened to the Jews. The question was, of course, what is responsibility, to what extent, and to what extent was it compatible to what the Germans did. I would say, to some extent, it is close to the famous theory of the, let's call it a double genocide, but this time coming from the Jewish side. Especially when the Soviet government was accused, especially during the Cold War, that it consciously refrained from telling Jews that they had to escape. Of course, if we're talking about other reasons, that the government didn't have time, it was preoccupied with other things, then this accusation is not that severe. But still, this is, I would say, an important accusation that, again, comes mainly from the Jewish side. The Soviet government launched this big project aimed at removing part of the population from the threatened areas immediately at the beginning of the war. But of course, not everyone was eligible to move, not everyone was encouraged to move. And in fact, only people who were deemed as critically necessary for the survival of the regime were ordered to leave. In this sense, I would say there are less interesting for us, probably for our study, because these people didn't have a leeway and couldn't decide whether they wanted to move or not, and they were simply ordered to leave. This was quite a big group of the population, especially in such a big and an important Soviet city as Kiev, which was the capital of Soviet Ukraine. It included government functionaries at various levels, security functionaries, and all those who worked in defense industries. Again, Kiev hosted, had many people who were employed in this field.
Real, can I excuse me, can I just jump for a second and ask you to make your presentation full screen so that we
full screen?
just,
I tried to do it, but somehow, it
you couldn't do it?
Yes, I can try, but let's see.
If it doesn't work, it's okay, but let's give it a shot.
It's better indeed. Well, first time I did work, my apologies. So at the same time, even though the government did not explicitly tell all other people what to do, it created infrastructure for them, which could be used for a large evacuation of all those who were not regarded as critically necessary. And in Soviet parlance, they were referred to as all possible human resources. And this was a place for Jews to try to use and to flee on their own with explicit or implicit government permit. Again, the government did not say explicitly what these people had to do. And they had, local functionaries, and of course Jews had. This was the opportunity to display initiative. Of course, it would be curtailed by other functionaries, but this was a theoretical, the only place for for masses of Jews, or if they wanted to escape. So in this sense, the Soviet evacuation was not only security-related or defense-related project. It was, to some extent, a humanitarian project, even though it was definitely not the most important priority for the Soviet government. Let me say a couple of words about the evacuation from Kyiv. There are, of course, factors that acted to encourage Jews to leave, and other factors, I can tell right now, more factors that discouraged Kievan Jews from leaving. On the negative side, we should, of course, remember the very good memories of the German occupation of Kyiv during the First World War and the peace it brought for all people, and especially for Jews. In the, amidst pogroms. Second, it was a very, very big and important Soviet city. Let's not forget that it was the biggest Soviet city in terms of population and sheer number of people that the German army succeeded in capturing. And of course, an average Soviet citizen thought, and Jews were no exception, that the Soviets would never surrender. They would do everything not to surrender it, and indeed this was the Soviet propaganda claim. Second, it was a very Soviet city in the sense that its population makeup changed enormously during the pre-war decades, and because of the purchase. So enormous number of people, including Jews, were purged out of the city. They simply disappeared. They didn't live there anymore. And hence, in very many respects, the profile of the average Kievan Jew was, it became much more Soviet by the beginning of the war. In contrast to many other cities and localities in the former Pale of Settlement. Again, since it was a very, very big city, an important city, there were very many people with their families who were employed in Soviet government at various levels in military industries. All these people could flee, and actually they fled overwhelmingly because they were ordered to do so. I would say probably the only big positive factor that that really mattered was the fact that almost 3 months passed after the beginning of the war until the city was captured. It was a lot of time, by the standards of that war. Theoretically, Soviet Jews living in Kiev had almost 3 months to decide whether to get out of the city or probably to stay. Let me briefly survey the military developments around Kiev with an eye to the prospects of evacuation. Everything, of course, began on this first day of the war when the city was bombed. And of course, this raises a big question to what extent, and these bombardments actually never stopped. Sometimes they became more intensive or less intensive, but they never stopped. And it raises another question: to what extent people interpreted airstrikes as a development that would be necessarily followed by a land offensive. We have contradicting testimonies coming from the Jewish sources, not only from the Jews, but what interests us here is mostly Jewish testimonies. So some interpret it as a sign of the even in German land offensive, and some claimed, I would say, and justly so, that it could be interpreted differently, and probably the Germans would never come. And we have examples from the Second World War that the land offensive never materialized. The relatively big group of Jews that fled immediately in the first weeks after the war were mainly led by their instincts and pre-war knowledge of what happened to Jews in German-dominated Europe. And of course, none of them could know anything about the Holocaust, the final stage of the Holocaust, because it simply didn't begin by the beginning of the war. So we're talking mainly about instincts and nothing more. In terms of timing, it was of course the best time to evacuate because people could convert their property, their valuables into money, and they could choose destinations very often where to go and to find better destinations. Of course, they were in less haste to do it. The big development on the front came in the mid-July when the Germans first tried to enter the city, but this attempt was thwarted. But the Soviet military situation started to deteriorate, and it involved, among other things, artillery shelling over the city almost non-stop. Artillery shelling, as far as we know, as it was interpreted by many Kievan Jews, it was a different side, not bombardments, because artillery was positioned next to the city. It means that the German land armies were close. It became more difficult to evacuate. At the same time, there was more realization that people started to realize, Kievan Jews, that it was probably a good time to leave it, because either because they would be persecuted as Jews if the Germans come, or for general reasons they could simply perish as a result of this artillery shelling. The next came the second German attack to take the city. It was again halted. The local population was ordered, given all by the Soviet authorities, to take part in building anti-tank trenches and planting mines. Everyone saw it, everyone knew about it. It was a sure sign that the German armies were close, and the threat of the German takeover was real. In mid-August 1941, the German High Command actually made a very important, crucial decision regarding Kyiv, and Hitler signed the so-called supplement to their directive number 34, which in most broad lines said that the Ukraine should be neutralized, occupied, and it should come before the onslaught on Moscow. As a result of this big change in the German plans, Moscow was in fact spared, but the fate of Ukraine and the fate of the Ukrainian Jews was sealed. Hitler, of course, preferred economic gains to political ones. Political means economic gains. This is Ukraine, and political gains, it is the capture of the Soviet capital. As a result of the German successful maneuvers near Kiev, since the 22nd of August, there existed a real threat of the complete encirclement of Soviet armies. And as a result, it became almost impossible to flee the city or to evacuate, to use the Soviet term. And it is a very important thing to remember, since it means that actually they didn't have 3 months to leave. They had much less time at their disposal. As you see probably less than 2 months. And on September 13, 19, Kyiv falls, and of course, it was the end of the story. The last window for evacuation was closed. What did Kievan media write on Jews? What could alert Kievan Jews to escape? It did mention quite often, I would say, anti-Jewish measures, various anti-Jewish measures taken by the Germans in Europe and also in the occupied Soviet territories, from occupation to starvation and even sporadic killing. And of course, it was an important sign, of course, that would lead Kievan Jews to move. At the same time, it was always highlighted that this persecution, this discrimination took place along other people, Poles, Russians, Belarusians, Ukrainians, and so on. So Jews could not really figure out to what extent these reports, if they are to be believed, would discriminate specifically against them. In many respects, I would say these Soviet reports, as presented in Kievan media, was accurate. And indeed, these were accurate stories. At the same time, the Soviet media everywhere, including the city of Kiev, suffered from a severe credibility crisis. To put it simply, very few people believed it because no one took it seriously as a news coverage source before the war. So, and very many Soviet Jews refused to believe it after the outbreak of the war. Another thing that factor that would lead Kievan Jews to flee, I would say quicker or at all, is whether they knew something real, would know something real from the Soviet media about how close the German armies were. On the whole, the overwhelmingly the tone of the Soviet media in Kiev was nothing to write home about. All quiet on the Western Front. The Soviet armies was indeed the Western Front, and everything is under control. From time to time, there were some details published about the battles and localities where they took place, but overwhelmingly, the names of localities were not given, and one could hardly figure out from this reporting how close the German armies were. And of course, nothing was ever written about in the Soviet media about what took place specifically around Kiev, which was, of course, what was of primary interest to Kievan Jews. Only in the last weeks before the occupation, in mid-August, the tone changed somewhat, and the main refrain of the Soviet media changed as for Kiev will always remain Soviet. That is, to put it otherwise, we will do everything and defend the city at any cost. And in retrospect, we understand it was, the very bad sign that this slogan appeared, but of course, local inhabitants in a real time could interpret it differently. Again, here, I would say specifically with respect to informing the population, specifically Kievan Jews, about the proximity of the German armies, the Kievan media was mostly propaganda tool. It didn't supply the necessary critical information in real time. the information could come from
Kirill, I wonder if we can maybe stop here because I'm a little bit concerned about the time. Let's have maybe Yakov jump into his presentation, and then we'll continue in the Q&A. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so Yakov, so I'm gonna, first of all, I want to remind everyone to submit your questions via email to cannon@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter at Cannon Institute, or on our Facebook page. Please include your name and affiliation when sending questions. And thank you so much, Kirill, for your remarks. And I'm going to pass the microphone to Yakov Falkov. Dr. Yakov Falkov is a research fellow at the International Institute for Counterterrorism at the Interdisciplinary Center at Herzliya, Israel. He's also a lecturer in guerrilla warfare and terrorism history and theory at the IDC and Tel Aviv University. He's the author of 2 books, Forest Spies, The Intelligence Activity of the Soviet Partisans, 1941-1945, and Between Hitler and Churchill, 2 Jewish Agents, and the effort made by British intelligence to prevent secret Polish-Nazi collusion. Yakov, please.
Thank you very much, Isabella. Thank you for this very kind introduction. Thank you for having me today. I will share my presentation in a second, and we will proceed. Yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah. Now it's okay. So I was asked to present this very interesting story about the knowledge of the Soviet intelligence, and particularly of the Soviet partisan movement, about the events where this tragic event of Babi Yar, and in general about the Holocaust in the Nazi-occupied territories of the Soviet Union. And I would like to start, since my book is dedicated to the Soviet partisan movement and its intelligence infrastructure. So I would like to start from presenting very briefly the story of this movement. Actually, we are talking about the guerrillas, the Soviet guerrillas who fought behind the front line against the Nazis. And the very first attempts to establish such a structure started already in the first weeks of the German occupation. But these attempts proved very unorganized, even chaotic, and there were many different Soviet entities, namely the unfamous NKVD, which was the Soviet Secret Service, and the military intelligence, and even the political directorate of the Red Army. All these were trying to send their people behind the front line in order to obtain every possible piece of information about the situation behind the front line, not only to support the fighting of the Red Army, but also to learn about the political situation behind the front line, since from the very beginning, the Soviet authorities in Kiev, but also in Moscow and in other places, were eager to know what actually happens in the German occupied territories and what is the attitude of the local population towards the occupiers. And as I said, this activity proved very chaotic in the beginning of the occupation, and it was only in late May, June 1942 that the centralized authority called the Central Command of the Soviet partisan movement was established in Moscow. And from this specific period of time onwards, we are talking about a growing, quite centralized body which spread its detachments and representatives all over the occupied territory, starting from the north in Estonia and Leningrad region, and ending with, let's say, Crimea and South Russia. And for some still unknown reason, Stalin decided to dismantle this body already in the beginning of 1944, and until the end of that year, almost all the partisan movements branches across the still occupied territories were dismantled by the Soviets, except all the Ukrainian partisans who were sent or dispatched to Eastern Europe to gather the intelligence, mostly to gather the intelligence information prior to the coming of the Red Army. So while speaking about the Babi Yar tragedy, actually we are talking about this initial period in the lifetime of the Soviet partisan movement, when most of the operations were actually done by those different bodies, NKVD and the military intelligence of the Red Army and so on. And starting from quite the very beginning, this partisan guerrilla apparatus was trying to establish its own gathering system across the occupied territories, starting from above, from the, as I told already, the central command of the partisan movement in Moscow, and down to the very tiny units of the partisan movement and very remote corners of the occupied territories. And in many places we find actually these capabilities of gathering the information, human intelligence, field intelligence, counterintelligence, and of course in some places there were even technical equipments, different kinds of equipment to gather the information from different German communication lines. And again, we are talking about gathering the information while talking about the Holocaust itself. We are talking about, firstly, agents' reports provided by the agents infiltrated into the different structures of the German occupying administration. We are talking about the local population testimonies quite from the very beginning of the occupation. It is striking that these initial partisans, initial guerrilla fighters, were already instructed by their superiors to ask primarily about the general situation in the occupied territories, but also in many places, very frequently, about the fate of the local Jewish population. And of course, we can see the interrogations of German prisoners of war and a few deserters who came to the Soviets from the German units. And many of them, again, were asked about the general situation of the local population, about the atrocities against the local population, and again, about the fate of the Jews in those territories. And no less interestingly, a few survivors of the Holocaust events who were lucky enough to reach the partisans at different stages of the occupation, they were interrogated about the general situation in the German occupied territories, about their own fate and about the fate of their relatives. And even more than that, they at some occasions, they were allowed to write letters to their families in the Soviet territory. And those letters were strictly censored, supervised by the intelligence or counterintelligence officers within the partisan movement, and many mentioning of Holocaust events were picked up by those officers and then reported to their superiors in Moscow. So we are talking about the phenomenon, which starts, as I already said, in the beginning of the occupation, from different sporadic reports about the Holocaust, and finishes already in 1944, when, as I said, the Soviet Ukrainian guerrillas entered Eastern European territories. They are still trying to inform their superiors about the fate of the last remnants of the Jewish communities in these regions. and what is interesting no less is that from the beginning, in the first month of the occupation, the reports, the information about the fate of the Jewish population was spread among different reports about the general grim situation in the occupied territories. But later on, starting, let's say, from mid-1942 or later this year, there appeared also such titles, as you may see here, the anti-Jewish terror in different partisan intelligence reports, which actually marks the shift in the understanding of the Soviet partisan intelligence officers of the entire situation of the Jewish population in the occupied territories. By now, they knew for sure that they are writing about something, about the phenomenon which addresses specifically the local Jewish population. And again, we are talking about the very wide geography of this reporting, starting from the north, from the Baltic states, from Leningrad, and finishing up with Crimea, and of course, places near Stalingrad. And what is interesting, from quite the very beginning, these gatherers of the intelligence information, they were trying to obtain the information about the central sites, cities, and events of mass killings of Jewish resistance, even uprisings. They were trying to describe precisely the killing methods of the occupying authorities, of the Einsatzgruppen. They reported about the victims' age and gender, stressing especially the killing of the Jewish kids by poisoning and in other ways. They were also addressing the origin of the Jewish victims, separating the local Jewish population and those who were brought by the Nazis from different Europe countries to the places like Rumbola to be killed there. And of course, they were gathering the information about the actual murderers, the Germans and their local collaborators who assisted them in different ways in killing the local Jewish and exterminating the local Jewish population. And at least in my eyes, the most remarkable achievement of this intelligence gathering process was the clear understanding, at least from, let's say, summer 1942, that what's going on in the German occupied territories is actually genocide. They didn't use this word since it was invented only later, actually after the war, but it was completely clear to them that the local Jewish population in the German occupied territories is being totally, completely exterminated. And here, probably the key testimony belongs to this guy and actually to the Latvian staff, the so-called Latvian stuff in Latvia, of the Soviet partisan movement, Iman Sulmalis, who spent almost 1 year in the German occupied territories. He was an activist of the local communist youth movement, the so-called Komsomol, and he went to the Soviet territory in mid-1942 and wrote a very interesting report about the general situation in occupied Latvia. And among other things, you may see here, he titled this chapter of his report, The National Question, and he wrote, in occupied Latvia, Jews are being exterminated as a people. And he understood clearly that they are being exterminated completely, that he is actually talking about the genocide. But again, the partisan intelligence didn't use this word genocide. And now we are approaching the subject of Babi Yar in Ukraine, in Kiev. Actually, I haven't seen many reports, or probably only one, about this tragedy in the reports provided by different Soviet intelligence authority, which were trying again to act in the German occupied territory as guerrillas. But this one, as you may see, provided by the Ukrainian NKVD partisan detachment to Moscow in late autumn, actually a very brief time after the tragedy itself. It speaks, as you may see here, describes briefly but quite precisely what happened actually in Kiev to the local Jewish population. And you may see here, from the very beginning of the occupation, the Germans started the pogroms and shootings, and these harmed especially the Jewish population. They are stressing the fact that the Germans are killing especially the Jews, and during a single day, they are talking here about 40,000 Jews who had been murdered. We now know that this number was actually smaller, but here again, taking into consideration the very complicated situation, operational situation in the field in Ukraine by this time, again, at least to my opinion, we are talking about a remarkable achievement of the Soviet intelligence, of the Soviet partisan guerrilla intelligence. And again, this report was sent to the highest authorities in Moscow, in the NKVD headquarters, quite a short time about this, after this tragic event. And actually, the very important and interesting question is about the consumers of all this information, of all this understanding about the Holocaust in the occupied territories. And as far as I could see throughout my entire research, they were plentiful. And all of them knew exactly, all of them were recipients of this information. Let's start from the NKVD headquarters in Moscow. Mr. Beria, famous Lavrenti Beria, was getting these reports and reading them. He knew very well about the tragedy of the Jewish population in the occupied territories. Of course, Mr. Ponomarenko, the very important apparatchik, so-called apparatchik, the person very close to Stalin himself, and the head from late May 1942, the head of the central command of the partisan movement. He knew, he read those reports. He was from time to time talking with some Jews who were rescued or escaped from different killing sites in Belarus. Another very prominent Soviet apparatchik was Georgy Malenkov, again very close to Stalin, and of all the Republican chief communists in Latvia, in Lithuania, in Estonia, Belarus, Ukraine, all of them were completely aware of the fate of the Jewish population in their republics. And of course, we do not possess many signs or many testimonies about Stalin's knowledge of the Holocaust, but we know at least at some occasions in the very beginning of the occupation, he was informed by this guy, already mentioned, Ponomarenko, about the general situation in Belarus, and among other things, among other atrocities of the German occupying forces, the very grim attitude, brutal attitude of the Germans, of the Nazis towards the local Jewish population. It was also mentioned by Ponomarenko, who wrote about these things to Stalin. And after having learned about all this knowledge, very impressive knowledge of the Soviet authorities. And now I'm talking only about I'm stressing, yes, I'm talking only about the partisan intelligence. My current research focuses on the general entire knowledge of the entire intelligence community about the Holocaust, not only in the USSR, but also abroad. And as far as I can see now, today, they knew quite a lot, not only about the Jewish or fate of the Jewish population in the Soviet Union, but also in Europe. And despite all this knowledge, as was already mentioned by Kirill earlier, they published a very few pieces of information. Actually, only on a few occasions. For example, during this announcement of Mr. Molotov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Soviet Union, or during the very famous trip of Solomon Mikhoels to the US in the same time, but mainly they tried to hide their very precise, very deep knowledge about the situation and about the very important fact that the Jewish population is suffering mostly by the hands of the occupying forces. And to conclude, we may claim today that the situation in the occupied territories and the fate of the Jewish population in Ukraine, in Kiev, was dealt, and all over the occupied territories was dealt constantly by the partisan intelligence, by the Soviet guerrillas. Their reports were proved remarkable and were covering almost the entire occupation territory and describe all the central events and killing methods, and were consecutive and quite timely, which is very important. And the final point, or the one before the final point, they understood quite clearly, as was shown by the example of Ivan Tsutbalis, that what is going on in the occupied territories vis-a-vis the Jewish population is actually genocide, is actually the total mass killing of the entire Jewish population. And the rulers of the Soviet Union in the highest positions knew quite precisely about the Holocaust, which gave them, and that's my final point, which gave them a clear alternative to implement much more active information and propaganda policy than had been implemented by them throughout the entire war period and also afterwards. Since after the war, and it is shown by my current research, after the war, the information about the anti-Jewish atrocities grew even bigger, stockpiled in the Soviet Union, and in the years after the war, they knew more and more, but published almost nothing. And that's, as I said, is my last point. And I'm open to questions. Thank you very much.
Yakov, thank you so much. And I want to thank all of you for your excellent presentations. I want to go back to Martin and ask you, I think that what you showed, the aerial photos and projections, I think that it was really great to see that, because it is so hard to visualize what happened there, because of course, as we often say, there's so much that one can see, for example, at Auschwitz, and we can visualize and relate to what happened there. And it's so much harder to visualize what happened at Babi Yar because the landscape has been completely erased. And what your presentation made me wonder is, I remember at some point a few years ago hearing an idea that perhaps that path that Kyiv Jews walked with all of the checkpoints, the various stations where they would leave their luggage and their passports, that maybe it should be actually marked in the streets physically where it happened. And I wonder if that's being discussed now. I know that you're part of the Babi Yar Holocaust Memorial Center. I wonder if something like that is being considered at all.
Yes, they have actually taken some steps along those lines. It was an idea we had a few years ago, was to put in like a viewing point. So you go to the point where Halo was standing when he took various photographs, and then you can look through like a set of binoculars, more or less, and to see what he saw on that day immediately after the massacre. So that's one way, and I'm sure along the route there will be more things like the Stolpersteine, the things you have in Germany to mark either individuals or, in this case, particular places where things happened with some information there. And there's lots more opportunities now with the internet. You can literally have an app on your phone, so you go to that point, and when you're standing there, you'll get more information, maybe even images. I mean, the problem for a long time is we just didn't have much in the way of images, and the images we had, we couldn't work out where they were. But now we're beginning to piece it together much more closely. And surprisingly, the missing glue in that was really the testimonies. I was surprised without the testimonies, I still probably wouldn't have been able to piece the whole story together. But for a long time, the testimonies were actually confusing because they have these descriptions, but you're not quite sure what they're talking about. But once you understand the terrain, then the testimonies also make more sense. So it was quite revealing to me that if you combine these different media, aerial photography, ground photography, the witnesses, it starts to make more sense. And that, of course, is what we want, that people understand that this was not just a story that people made up. It all, literally thousands of people were involved on both sides. We have the names now of hundreds of the perpetrators, so it's not a mystery. To some extent, with Yakov's presentation, given the scale of the events at Babi Yar, it is a little surprising that Soviet intelligence didn't report more about this. This is my opinion, that because the whole of Kiev knew more or less exactly what happened by the next day.
Well, and in fact, I want to ask Kirill, so if the Soviet intelligence, as Yakov told us, did not really make a lot of its information public, did that information play at all maybe into behind the scenes actions, let's say with regards to evacuation? Was that at all used in those policy considerations? Kirill, you're muted. You're still muted.
Yes, so sorry. It depended how people interpreted this information. You know, in many, it was an interesting case. You know, it was after all, a very a totalitarian country. You know, which poked its long nose into everything, and for the first time in very many years, it didn't tell people explicitly what to do in such a crucial thing, whether they should flee the Germans or stay. And people had with the exception of those who were ordered to move, all others who could decide for the first time in their life. And for those who got used to this patronizing state, it was a big challenge. It does not necessarily mean that older people were, felt free enough, or younger people felt free enough. It was very, very, depended very much on who we're talking about. So I would say that the Soviet propaganda machine did present this information. It doesn't mean that it highlighted. It doesn't mean that this information was published on the first page, probably not even on the second page, but it was there for those who were eager to read. The big question is, of course, to what extent Soviet people in these 3 months wanted to read Soviet paper. What could they find there, after all? For example, on the first page, in contrast, one could read plenty of reports of a continuous enrollment in the institutions of higher education in Kyiv. So business as usual was a very important thing there, or preparing for autumn harvesting. another important thing, and is of course this idea that you've got nothing to worry about, the government will take care of you, was very familiar to very many people. That no doubt it influenced many people, even though on this third page they could read other things about the Jews being persecuted. So it was a very ambiguous state of affairs. I mean, the government, of course, could be rightly accused of not highlighting it, but at the same time, it is impossible to say that it didn't. You know, in many, to some respect, it behaved as if it were a free country. People could decide. The thing is that, you know, and the Soviets did know a lot at this time. They knew much more than they conveyed to their people. This is very important.
Thank you very much. I have a question that I often think about, and most recently it occurred to me. I'm sure you've all seen Sergei Loznitsa's film Babi Yar, The Context, and you talked about it. When we talk about the explosions that happened in Kiev, and there is a direct link between the Nazis, the Germans seeking retribution for those explosions, blaming the Jews, and then Babi Yar happens after those explosions. The explosions are basically the result of the NKVD work. Before they left Kiev, they left explosives in big buildings. What I wonder about is, do we know what was the plan with regards to Kiev Jews before there were the explosions? What can we say about the plans that the Germans had with regards to Kiev Jews before they knew that there would be an explosion?
Can I answer this?
Please, go ahead.
I think they used the explosions as a pretext, and they had done this in other places when also they found corpses in NKVD jails. That also was used to provoke pogroms further west early on. But they were already escalating the policy against the Jews quite dramatically in the weeks and months just before Kiev is taken. So the Kamenets Podolsky, just a month before, 23,000 people are shot. Not quite everybody. They still set up a ghetto there for some workers, but all the Hungarian deportees are shot there, and most of the local Jews as well. And then in Vinnytsia, in Berdichev, in Zhytomyr, large proportions of the Jewish population are being shot there, including women and children, just before they get to Kiev. In some ways, the wait to get to Kiev causes them to slow down with their advance, and then they do start increasing the percentage of Jews they're killing in the areas they're moving through. So actually in Western Ukraine, it's only like 10% or so in a lot of places they go through, and they set up ghettos, and it's not till the summer of 42 that the majority of the population is shot there. But as they go further east, partly because the workers are not so much used to them, the craftsmen in the West are needed by the German army, but the industrial workers have either been evacuated, or the Germans think there are enough industrial workers, we don't need these Soviet Jews. So they've gradually been expanding it to women and children in July and August in other parts. And so even in Fastiv, just before they get to Kiev, they kill almost all the Jews there just a few days before they get to Kiev. So we know they're planning to kill most, if not all, the Jews soon after they arrive. Even so, Kiev is a kind of big escalation. This is the first large city where they do this. In other cities like Minsk and Vilnius, they do set up ghettos, and quite a large proportion of the Jews are kept for a longer period.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Kirill, go ahead.
Yes, I would like to read. Yes, of course, basically, I agree with Martin. You know, it's of course, I would say the specific SS unit that entered, there was much autonomy among SS commanders, even though they acted under the same guidelines. But you know, they could interpret it differently, dependent on the personality of the SS commanders. And those who entered Kiev were radicals, you know, judging by what they did before. So, the other thing I would like to emphasize, the food factor. Ukraine, from the German perspective, was a place with the abundant food reserves, earmarked, of course, for Germany. And it means that and there were too many people living there. It means that part of the population had to be starved, and Jews were the first in line. so it was the perspective of the military economic authorities, which were extremely influential. And Kit would give us an indication of, what were the prospects for the Kievan Jews, even if they somehow managed to survive first several weeks. But I doubt whether they could really, they could chances, at least so many people could survive the first winter of 41-42.
Jakob, did you want to add something?
Yes, I would like to answer Martin's earlier remark about the number of reports about the Babi Yar tragedy. Actually, I do believe that there were much more, could be much more, since the partisans or the people who the NKVD left, planted in the city and its near vicinity, they were trying to gather as much information as possible about the general situation in the city and about German atrocities. But we have to bear in our minds two core facts. The first one is that the operational situation in the field, including in Kiev, by this time was very, very complicated. Many of these guys who were very young people, actually girls and boys, teenagers, they perished. They were caught and killed almost immediately by the Germans. Many of them, or even most of them, were not provided the very basic communication equipment to send their messages to their superiors, by now only in Moscow. Yeah, even the NKVD, the famous and powerful, allegedly powerful NKVD, left its main agent, its representative, undercover in the city without such an equipment, without the ability to transmit his reports straightforward to Moscow. So they were trying to use dispatchers whom they were sending behind the front line to the Soviet territory. But again, these guys, who again mostly were boys and girls, they were caught by the Germans and killed on the spot. So this is the first very important fact. And the second fact is that we haven't seen all the reports. They are mostly, the intelligence reports are closed until today in the Soviet archives and in Russian now, the Russian archives, and specifically those of the special services. So I was very lucky to see at least few of them. And this one, which talks about the Babi Yar tragedy, but I do believe that there should be much more until today in the Russian archives. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have a question from Joseph Bradley, Professor Emeritus from University of Tulsa. He's asking whether anyone can comment on the involvement of the local population at Babi Yar. How were they recruited? Was the involvement of the local population not one of the reasons for the erasure of the massacre? This is the question. So I wonder if someone would want to take on this question. And we have just 7 minutes. So who would like to?
I'll be very brief. Babi Yar, in this respect, is a slight exception in the sense the Germans arrived there and did it so soon after they arrived that there wasn't much of a local police force they could rely on. They had some Western Ukrainians who'd be brought in mainly at the Melnikite branch, and they were present and took part in forcing the Jews to undress, in sort of beating them along the way and guarding. They were among the guards at the shooting, but it doesn't seem that very many of them at all were involved in the actual shooting. There were one or two collaborators in the Einsatzgruppen units, so they were also involved. And then later on, obviously, the Ukrainian police in Kiev has a big job arresting any Jews that are found after this. So there is a lot of collaboration in that region, and also I read just yesterday quite a few reports of people handing Jews over to the Germans to be shot at Babi Yar at this time and obviously later on. So this kind of denunciation was fairly widespread. But again, you have to think of Kiev as a city where there's quite a bit of intermarriage. So there were also non-Jewish people who maybe had relatives who were Jewish and who were friends with their neighbors and so on. So there's mixed emotions amongst the population overall. But of course, Kiev was a site of much anti-Semitism after the war as well. So it was not too untypical from the rest of Ukraine.
Anybody else would like to comment? Okay, well, I think that we are running out of time, but what I was wondering about is whether someone maybe can say a few words. I know that two of you are involved with the Babi Yar Holocaust Memorial Center. Of course, as Natan mentioned, efforts to construct a memorial worthy of the tragedy have been thwarted tried, and things have been tried and thwarted and vanished for a very long time. I wonder if you can leave us with a couple of words about where the project is at the moment and what we can look forward to in the coming, I don't know what, in the near term.
As far as I'm aware, the actual target date now is around 2026 for a real large-scale museum to be constructed and open. But in the meantime, they're putting in a lot of sort of markers along the way, art exhibits. A synagogue was opened there earlier this year, and there is a plan now to have a 3D model showing much of the information that I shared with you today and make that available to people fairly soon, so that we have increasing amounts of information and more appropriate memorials built up collectively that can't really be reversed. The idea is to sort of get the momentum going so that even if a different government comes in, it won't be easy for them to sort of reverse it. But politics is unpredictable, so we just have to keep working as hard as we can.
Right. Yes, there has been certainly a lot of politics around the memorial. I don't know, Kirill, do you want to add anything on this?
It's I agree with Martin. This is more. But of course, there is as you see, there is a politics, and there are, but things are moving ahead, and this is a good sign.
Very good. Thank you so much for your excellent presentations, for your excellent discussion. I want to thank, of course, Natan Sharansky for his opening remarks and Ambassador Breed as well for joining us. I also want to thank our co-sponsor, the History and Public Policy Program, and to all of you who have virtually joined us today. We look forward to seeing you again at our next events. So for now, thank you and goodbye.